And I'm going to take up the rear real quick. Going to go over Ikoku Nikki. So Ikoku Nikki is also known as Journal with which is a very poorly localized title, but it is what it is. It's based off a manga. So this manga was published in Feel Young. So Feel Young is a kind of josei magazine, josei oriented series, and you can kind of see it in the kind of lankier designs, the paler palettes, stuff like that. The sort of general premise and pace. Feel Young, relatively popular josei series that kind of popped up in the '90s and continued all the way up until recently, at least the print publication. I think it transitioned into a the publication in the early 20s, I guess a couple of years ago. But the author is Yamashita Tomoko. So Yamashita Tomoko is a pretty prolific author. Again, mainly writing for josei magazines, that sorts of oriented magazines. Relatively slow series, talking about kind of life, everyday kind of themes. I believe she also had another series that did get adapted previously, also known as The Night Beyond the Tricorner Window. I believe that came up 1 or 2 years ago, I want to say, because I do remember seeing it in one of the previews. But yeah, relatively prolific author there. The anime adaptation is being headed by Shuka. Shuka is an animation studio who also headed Yuzuki-san Chi no Gyon Kyodai, or the four Yuzuki-san siblings, or whatever it's called. Um, I believe Dark covered that before. They
Yeah.
did season two. Yeah, they did season 2 of Durarara, and they also did some of the later seasons of Natsumi Yujincho. I believe they did starting from season 5 and onwards, and some of the movies afterwards. So essentially, Shuka put kind of took one of their main core members, I want to say, or their OG members in Oshiro Miyuki. So Oshiro Miyuki has pretty much worked on all of these like main Shuka series, produced series, and this is their first directorial debut. And Oshiro gathers together mostly experienced people and veterans from kind of Shuka's various works by networking between Shuka's various works. So again, most of these experienced veterans are from their networking during the Jurada season 2 and Natsume Yujincho days, but they gather a couple of people from the outside as well. Most notably, Kiyasu Kohei as a screenwriter. So Kiyoshi Kohei is a screenwriter who has had a couple of he's actually much more known for his acting and doing stuff for like live action theater kind of works. But in recent years, I want to say in the recent decade or so, he's gotten a little bit into screenwriting here as well. Or he's transitioning more and more into screenwriting. He's done a couple of stuff for stuff like Prince of Tennis. But yeah, he's the screenwriter for this work as well. Going over to the voice acting cast, the voice acting cast is pretty much 90%, 95% older veterans. You have, you know, Sawashiro Miyuki being one of the main characters in the kind of the aunt character in Kodai Makio, as well as a lot of the other supporting cast members also being veteran voice actors and actresses. You have Matsuya Eriko, who did Nao Kamiya in Cinderella Girl, Idolmaster Cinderella Girls, as well as Fujikisaki in Uma Musume, right? You have Soabi Junichi. You have Ohara Sayaka, who's most famous for Urza Scarlet in Fairy Tale. Morohoshi Sumire, Hoshimiya Ichiko in Aikatsu, and Kondo Takashi. So Faust and Potemkin Guilty Gear. So a lot of these sorts of like much older veterans, right? People who have been in the industry and been doing roles that are like in the 90s, 2000. I want to say early 2000s is kind of when they really had their heyday, right? So a lot of these older veteran voice acting casts, but they are here in support of the voice actress who's voicing the main character, the niece in Takumi Asa. And so the voice actress behind this character, Takumi Asa, is Mori Fuko. So Mori Fuko this is her actual first breakout role. This is her first role that is not just like, you know, Nurse 2 or whatever it is, right? This is the first named role, and it turns out to be a protagonist role. So, congratulations to her. This is very interesting setup, but yeah, she is the only kind of new whippersnapper actor in a sea of very old, much older, like veteran voice actors and actresses. So that's sort of the setup. Going over to opening ending, the opening is called Sonare by Tomu. So Tomu is a pretty popular female singer-songwriter out of Tokyo. She has performed in the Budokan before, I believe. She has written songs for Blue Box and Blue Box Aobako, Aonohako, or whatever it was. I believe Toast covered that, as well as City the Animation, which I also reviewed before. Um, I would say this is a pretty, music-wise, it's a pretty gentle, like piano-focused opening in terms of instrumentals. Um, it has some interesting vocals. I think, obviously, her Tomo's register is a little bit lower, and it has a lot more like whispery, wind, kind of like air in her vocals. I would say it's a little bit that's a little bit more common. Looking at her Wikipedia page of how she kind of got into the singing um, part of the music industry a little bit later. Um, it has a little bit more commonality, I would say, with people who haven't done as much formal kind of this classical choral vocal training throughout their childhood, definitely. But it is still decent vocals nevertheless. She has decent chops, and the song itself is fine. The storyboard setup is pretty standard, but I do like that sort of like pencil drawn art style of it. But the pacing of it, the vocals, the overall like instrumentation kind of makes it seem more like an ending than an opening. And I've mentioned this for a couple of reviews back to back almost, and here and there. I want to say throughout this year as well as in previous years, and in my opinion, this is becoming like a stronger trend. And I think the reason behind it is, I think it kind of comes with the territory with the industry hiring pretty much like mostly outside non-Anisong J-pop artists these days, right? And so a lot of these and you guys can correct me if you think I'm going crazy with this, but it's like because they're hiring a lot of these outside, let's say indie J-pop um artists, right? That are like just like singer-songwriters just singing about, their childhood or like little romance or things about life or whatever, right? And they're not singing like Anisong stuff. They tend to create a lot more of these like standard, peaceful, like kind of whatever happy-go-lucky openings.
Yeah.
And because it's like a lot of these Anisong artists don't do like they're not mythroid, right? Myth and Roid, right?
Yeah.
They're not out here. They're not coffee and they're not going out here being like like the death is upon us or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
They're fucking writing songs about girls on benches or whatever, sitting on benches like drawing on diaries or whatever. So I think it's like an inevitable trend. um it's not like the worst thing or anything like that, but it is definitely an interesting thing that is happening, I would say. um I would still like a Myth and Roid opening every once in a while though, to be fair. um but that and Ollie Project, except for the fact that they got wound up in was it a money laundering scheme that ended their band, or was it something else? It was like something involving money. It was either like tax related or it was like money laundering or something like that, if I remember correctly, or like they scammed somebody. But anyways, so that was the opening, and then the ending is called Kotosude, also known as Hearsay by Bialystocks. So Bialystocks is kind of like an up and coming two-man group from Tokyo. They've been relatively pretty decently popular amongst their niche crowds in the recent years. Pretty good vocals, pretty good song. I would say the storyboard is super minimal. Like it is very, very, very minimal. The static frames are fine; they look good, but I would say, it's overall nothing to write home about. It's a lot of the whole like you have like the kind of panning scene of like as soon as and of like the character kind of doing something like like picking up laundry or like pointing at something or whatever, like coming into focus, and they're like, oh, they finish pointing at something, and then like the scene cuts into the character doing something else, like picking up a mug or whatever it is, right? It's that sort of ending. Again, nothing really home to write about. In terms of the audio visuals kind of in the episodes, the main character designs are, they're a lot more like thinner, lankier on average. I would say some of them are even kind of almost like leaning into androgynous territory. There's a lot of, thinner art style, a lot of the paler palettes that are almost like reminiscent of, I want to say, like uh, late 2000s, early 2010s, going to late 2010s, like Western webtoons, web comics, or stuff like that. Maybe even like Korean web comics. You see a lot of these sorts of like styles. Also in josei related magazines as well, and it kind of fits that sort of like general culture and drawing style. Um, a lot of the uh it's a very like standard slice of life. It's a lot of talking, a lot of sitting at tables, picking up mugs. There's not even that much like cooking or like food porn or whatever. um for the most part, it's a lot of these animations are relatively minimal, and most of it's just talking. There's not a lot of frames, but it's just slice of life stuff, so you don't need that many frames anyways, right? So it's okay in that way. Nothing really stands out in terms of animation quality other than maybe some of like the character close-ups, right? When you have some certain like introspection happening, and there's like this like surreal like mind palace like sequence going on where they're like in the middle of the desert or like at sea or whatever it is, right? Where they're like flashing back to a memory, and they're closing in, maybe they're crying or whatever it is, right? There are some of these close-ups that are nice, and the still frames are decent. Um, or the static models are decent, but I would say, the overall animation quality is nothing home to write about, is what I would say. In terms of the BGM, it's extremely minimal. There's usually no BGM or very, very, very soft, almost unnoticeable BGM throughout all the different scenes. There's a heavy focus on, again, dialogue and just kind of like the silence, which kind of adds to the overall premise of the series, or some of the themes of the series, which is, part of it is kind of like dealing with loneliness, dealing with, things by yourself, stuff like that. So I think that's like intentional design, to be honest. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'll just go into the story. The story is the start of the story is that you have the main character, the Takumi Asa, right? Her family, her entire immediate family, kind of passes away in a car crash, and she kind of gets picked up by her aunt, Kodai Makio, due to kind of Makio kind of going on this like almost like manly charitable impulse, right? She's like, you know, I'll take care of you. I don't want you to be, tossed around like ragdoll amongst relatives and live like a terrible life, crappy life, not being cared by anybody. So, I'll pick you up. Like I'm not the biggest. I wasn't the biggest fan of your mom. We had some disagreements, but I'll pick you up. I'll shelter you at least. And so she picks her up, and they start living together, right, in a house, and the rest of it, um kind of the day-to-day lives, right? The story in each episode itself, the story does tend to go on kind of these general tangents, right? Or there are some episodes that might have like a general objective of like, this general thing is happening, this significant event is happening in Asa's life, or this like event is happening, or this like these specific developments are happening to some sub characters. Like there's like minor objectives, but in general, it's like each episode is kind of like the day to day lives of the niece Takamiyasa, as well as the aunt Kodai Makio, and as well as like the evolutions, the character evolutions, the character developments of those two and the supporting characters, right? So it's kind of the day to day life of that, and obviously you have kind of the themes layered on throughout it all, throughout. Um, and you have these themes of dealing with loneliness, um kind of coming of age in the case of the niece, right? In case of Takemiasa, and doing that sort of coming of age both with guidance, previously from her parents, potentially from Makio and the others, and without guidance, right? Kind of doing things by herself now that she doesn't have now she's lost her parents, right? Um, her and the different characters kind of interacting with others and kind of trying to realize that the other person is a human being, is somebody some a character that has multiple complex like perspectives and it's not just like a 2D human being, right? um and this sort of like what it means to live alone and what it mean versus what it means to kind of live alongside a person and kind of interact with them and have these like different opinions, right? So these like general kind of very human social interaction based themes are of center stage in this series. And I think the series does a very good job of both setting these characters up and having them organically interact and evolve over time. Um, you have, the motifs, the motivations of these characters, right? And the setups of these characters are something again that you would find in real life, right? You would have, for instance, like the aunt is not like, oh no, I gotta take you in or blah blah blah. It's like she has sort of her problems, and you have this kid, this niece, that obviously can't be thrown out onto the streets, but and so she takes her in, and the niece is in her house, but and she has to take care of her every once in a while, right? But other than that, they are kind of acquaintances, come strangers, and it's not really like a "oh, I love you" kind of business, right? And then they've made these kind of personalities, right? Obviously, the niece is kind of niece. She's lost her family, and she's kind of growing up and trying to come of age. And the aunt is kind of like an awkward person. She's a novelist. She kind of does her own. She goes her own way, but that comes with kind of being a little bit more of an aloof, solitary nature, right? And then these two are trying to reconcile their differences and their different actions and their different thoughts on life while being next to each other, right? Um, and also trying to communicate properly, right? But sometimes, again, because it's like the aunt is a little bit is trying to do nice things, but sometimes comes off as brusque, sometimes a little bit as curt, and so on. And so a lot of that dialogue represents that. And I think the way this author has show get like written out that dialogue, a lot of these dialogue and introspections seem a lot more realistic than honestly 90% of series that I've watched slash read thus far, and even I want to say throughout my most of my like anime watching, manga reading, um, history. And a lot of these like sort of awkward interactions, right, where they're trying to communicate with each other but they're not doing it. Um, seem very humane, seem very um organically awkward, and it's not cringe, and it's like curt, and they're trying to be nice to each other, they're trying to communicate, but it's not a situation where the author is trying to represent some sort of like tsundere or some like stereotyped out like anime specific overblown niche stuff, right? It's not like a call and response like, oh, I actually want to be nice to you, but here, have this. It's not overblown. It's a very like, oh, like this is what a human being would say in real life kind of way. Like like I kind of want to show you this, but I didn't know. Maybe next time we should have communicated better, but I was too afraid. All this stuff, all this awkwardness that you would have when you were communicating with strangers, when you're communicating with acquaintances best, that are not, necessarily your immediate loved ones, right? Um, that sort of awkwardness, that sort of humaneness is all kind of represented. And even when dealing with these sorts of more sensitive topics, right, such as like a death in the family, or like how to deal with this sort of like loneliness or how to grow up, right? without getting guidance, right? And how to kind of adjust your life trajectory, right, the way that you want it. I think the author does a good job both with the dialogue as well as with the much slower pacing to make these sorts of sensitive interactions seem like it's not a dramatization, but rather like it's a very like it feels like a very like gentle hug. And what I mean by that is like a lot of the series when they're trying to cover like backstory, like, oh, how do I deal with having to, um, live with the fact that my parents died, but then I'm also living with my aunt, would often take like maybe one episode out in a season to be like, to have this like screaming match with the aunt, being like, "You don't know me," blah blah blah, and then like the niece would like run off to the playground or something like that, right? And so there would be like this dramatization to create this quick cathartic scene and resolution, right? Um, but this series specifically goes out of its way to avoid that sort of dramatization happening. So the way it approaches this sort of awkwardness, the way it approaches these sorts of like sensitive conversations is much more gentle, and that like I can really feel that in the story. So I do like that happening. Um, I also think that the support characters are very well, quite decently developed, and the cuts and the scene transitions as well. Um, I think it's and you have some interesting premises. Obviously, you have what is it for the former boyfriend or whatever of Makio kind of coming around and kind of dealing with the the niece that's around, right? The Asa who's around, but also dealing with his own feelings and his own life, right? While still being friendly with Makio, his former girlfriend, after having broken up initially, right? So um, these sorts of developments are done pretty well again in the story as well. So I do appreciate that a lot.
I will say
Um,
there's two
yeah.
clips I've seen from this show.
Hmm.
And one is I think it's the aunt Makio with the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend.
Hmm.
And they're like on the couch and they're being friendly or whatever. Um, and it's like I forget what exactly happens, but it's like the niece comes in and she's kind of like I don't really get why you two aren't like still together, right? And then they kind of
Hmm.
explain that it's like, well, um, we're just like just not really at that stage in life anymore, right?
Hmm.
Um, and the dialogue felt it was very like um it felt like a real conversation. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
it was
and that
kind
like
of like
setup
the
itself is also like something that would happen in like a modern like setting, like
yeah,
very
it was very much like the voice actors themselves were like just sitting on a couch talking to each other. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it felt very natural. And then the other one was a clip where I guess things kind of come to a head where
Hmm.
the niece is kind of frustrated and upset with how messy the house is, right? Um,
Hmm.
and they have like a small argument about, like I don't understand why you can't clean up, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, 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 yeah.
and I feel like that scene was kind of like the way that because the aunt kind of like she kind of like shuts down basically. She's like, I can't even fucking deal with this right now.
Hmm.
She has to like take a moment to kind of like collect herself before she can actually like explain like what she's feeling.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, I don't know. I just you don't really see stuff like that from anime very much, where it's like these are depictions of emotions that are like very um like obviously they're a bit played up because it's like it's a
yeah,
show,
because it has
right?
to be kind of yeah, yeah.
But it's still very like grounded and very like it feels very much like somebody who has like it's written by somebody who has like either gone through stuff like this or at least very least like dealt with somebody um and kind of like actually like understood what they were going through and kind of like really empathized with them at the very least and was able to write something like this in a very like human way. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was very interesting to see. I
yeah,
haven't watched the show myself yet, but definitely something I want to check out. But yeah,
yeah. And like even in the example that you just pointed out, in the second example with like the cleanup, it was like like in a standard anime setup, right? It would be something like the the aunt would be depicted as like a punkotsu, right? It would be like, oh, I'm klutzy. Oh, sorry, I'm just like messy. I'm like bad, but I'm a genius at writing, or like it would be that sort of
yeah,
like
but
setup, right? Contrast setup.
in this
But it's like this one. It's like she's a bachelor essentially. Like this is it's
yeah,
because
and
she's a fucking bachelor.
it was also very obviously like a symptom of depression. You know what I mean? It was very much
Mhm.
like she was explaining like it's easier for me to just let this shit pile up and not even have to think about it than like actually tackle like to even think about tackling like the idea of cleaning up because the whole
Right.
argument because the niece is like I don't understand why you can't just clean this shit. It takes like 10 minutes. Um and the aunt was like for me the sheer like idea of cleaning up is more
Mhm.
stressful than like the act itself, right?
Mhm.
Um and like that is depression, right? Like that
Right.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
in a depression. And yeah, it was very real. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas like in most of these kind of like drama series, it would be like, I don't understand why you can't just clean up, and then they like scream at each other, and like you said, one storms off, and it becomes an emotional moment or
Right.
something. But instead, it was like,
Yeah.
you know, it was two people kind of just explaining how they feel, and then like
Yeah.
deciding to, you know, I think at the end the niece was, well, how about I help you? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's like a thing that happens in life, which it
Yeah,
does. It's
yeah,
like yeah.
yeah. It was very
Yeah.
refreshing to
It's
see.
yeah. Yeah. That's exactly sort of what I was gonna say. It's very it was very refreshing and um again the way that the pace and like the setups happen obviously some people might think it's a lot of nothing, right? And again it doesn't like there's no mini arcs really and it's about the day-to-day lives, but I think if you do appreciate this sort of stuff it is a very like it's a gentle hug while still retaining like the themes that it needs to expound on. Well, the story isn't like completely just like oh, complete stream of consciousness. Just like we're just going to talk about random stuff. It's like it has its themes, it has its characters that it needs to develop. It just does it in a very gentle way, and I really do appreciate that. I think in terms of the overall rating, I would honestly give this an 8 out of 10. I'm afraid to like in my mind, I am afraid to give this like a higher score. Again, I've explained my kind of metrics many, many times. When I start going into like the nines, the tens, it's like I'm talking about like anime of the year, anime of the decade kind of level stuff.
Yeah,
But I do think it's definitely a 8 out of 10. I think if the animation quality was like if they had like made it really, really good somehow, they brought in whatever, right, Madhouse or wherever, right, it would have probably gone up into probably potentially nine territory. Um, but I think eight and I I I'm afraid to give it more than that because I feel like that would almost be kind of speaking to my bias towards liking stories like this, liking pastes like this, liking genres, subgenres like this. Um, if I push for my bias, I'll potentially give it an 8.5. But I think it's very solid the story in terms of how it is. The character designs are pretty good, especially during the close-ups. I think that's fine as is. So, and I don't think there's really anything too much to complain about in terms of the how the audiovisuals ended up, and certainly like the castings of both Asa, obviously Fumo, what is it? Who was it? Morifuko, as well as Saoshiro Miyuki doing pretty much doing the voice she was born to do, right?
yeah.
in Makio, right? Does a very good job as well as the rest of the cast. So, not too much, not much to complain about in terms of the audio visuals, but obviously the story does carry
I will
the
say,
weight of the value. Mm,
from what I've seen, a nice highlight of the audio visuals themselves
mm,
is not necessarily like the character acting, but the facial expression. right? I think the
Oh yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
depth of the facial expression is done quite well. So
Yes, yes. Again, especially during like close-ups and stuff like that of like the niece and so on.
yeah,
And the aunt as well. But yeah, very, very, very solid, I think, overall. And I think if somebody needs like a kind of breather from a lot of like the dramatized stuff, a lot of the standard back and forth that you might see in, say, a lot of these standard anime rom-coms, um, and so on, where it's like, oh, you don't believe me? I can't believe this. And then they do like the standard, runaway drama, catharsis,
yeah,
resolution, all that sort of stuff, right? Saving the cat from the tree, max social link with all the girls, all of that stuff. And if you're a little bit tired of that, I think this is definitely a nice little bench, a nice little respite to kind of come back to for sure. So yeah, 8 out of 10, and this was again Ikoku Nikki. So for um, this transliterated, it means a diary in another land or a diary in another country or something like that. And the kind of the figurative meaning is because Asa, again after losing her parents and kind of moving to her aunt Makio's house, is essentially in another country, another land. And Makio is sort of the queen, the witch in that sort of the lead in that other land. And Asa actually takes initiative to write diary by herself. So she is writing a diary in another land. So that's sort of where the name comes from. But yeah, again, if you guys want kind of respite, I would say from a lot of these like tired tropes and like back and forth dialogue and stuff like that. And you want something a little bit more organic, a little bit more slow pace, a little bit more refreshing. I would say definitely take this as a watch. Try this. I would definitely recommend it. And I don't necessarily recommend a lot of series these days, heartily, but this is definitely something I would recommend.